The Hamilton family butler opened their mansion's front door like he owned the place, looked me up and down, and said, "Service entrance is around back." I shoved past him without a word, walked straight into that marble foyer I'd seen in photos, and found my 22-year-old daughter Emma scrubbing the floor on her hands and knees, bruises covering both arms, wearing a filthy apron that read, "Hamilton Family Maid." What I did next would either save her life or destroy mine completely. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button. Let me take you back to how this nightmare began. 10 years ago, when Emma was 12 and my world collapsed with my wife's cancer diagnosis, I thought I was making the right choice. Margaret had been fighting for 18 months. The medical bills were drowning us. I had an opportunity to work overseas, building infrastructure projects in emerging markets. Good money, enough to secure Emma's future and maybe find peace with my grief. The Hamiltons lived 3 houses down from us in Westfield, New Jersey. Old money, charitable reputation, big white colonial with perfectly manicured gardens. Mrs. Patricia Hamilton had approached me at Margaret's funeral with what seemed like genuine compassion. "Richard, we know how difficult this must be," she'd said, touching my arm with practiced sympathy. "Emma is such a sweet girl. If you need to travel for work, we'd be honored to help with her care during school breaks and emergencies." I was broken, desperate, and completely unprepared for single parenthood. The Hamiltons had 3 children of their own, all successful. Patricia served on the school board. Charles Hamilton was a respected attorney. They attended the same church we'd gone to when Margaret was alive. "Just temporary assistance," I'd told Emma the night before I left. "Emergency contact information, maybe holiday visits when I can't make it back immediately." I never signed formal custody papers. What I signed was a limited power of attorney for educational and medical emergencies, something any responsible parent might do when traveling extensively for work. Patricia had presented it as routine paperwork, like giving grandparents permission to take a child to the doctor. Emma had cried, begged me not to leave, but I convinced myself I was being responsible. The overseas contracts were lucrative, but required constant travel to dangerous locations. I'd arranged for Emma to stay in our house with a live-in housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, while I was away. The Hamilton arrangement was supposed to be backup support, not primary care. That was my first mistake. I trusted people who spoke the right words while planning something entirely different. 3 weeks after I left for Guatemala, Mrs. Chen called with an emergency. Her mother had suffered a stroke in San Francisco, and she needed to leave immediately to provide care. She'd already contacted the Hamiltons as my designated emergency contacts. "Mr. Patterson, the Hamilton family has graciously offered to have Emma stay with them until you can arrange alternative care," Mrs. Chen explained over a crackling international connection. "They said it's no trouble at all, and Emma knows their children from school." I was managing a water treatment crisis in a remote village, dealing with equipment failures and potential cholera outbreaks. The call came at 3 in the morning local time, and I was exhausted from 18-hour workdays. "Just for a few weeks," I told Mrs. Chen. "I'll fly back to arrange something permanent." But the Guatemala project extended due to complications. Then there was an opportunity in Kenya that paid triple my normal rate. Then Bangladesh, then Colombia. Each project was supposed to be temporary, but international development work has a way of chaining opportunities together. The Hamiltons sent regular updates, photos of Emma looking healthy and happy, school reports showing good grades, holiday cards featuring Emma with their family, smiling in front of Christmas trees and birthday cakes. What I didn't know was that those early photos were carefully staged. What I didn't see was the gradual transition from guest to ward to servant that began within months of Emma moving in. I called Emma every few weeks initially, but the Hamiltons always had explanations for why she couldn't talk. Emma was at a sleepover. Emma was studying for exams. Emma was feeling emotional about her mother's death and needed space to process her grief. By the second year, I was calling monthly and speaking to Emma perhaps once every 3 months. She sounded fine during those brief conversations, if increasingly distant. I told myself this was normal adolescent behavior, that Emma was adjusting to her new environment. I was lying to myself, choosing financial opportunity and emotional avoidance over investigating why my daughter seemed to have less and less to say to me. By 2017, when Emma turned 15, the phone calls had become perfunctory quarterly check-ins. Emma's voice had changed, become more formal, more careful. She answered my questions politely, but never asked questions of her own. Never shared details about her daily life. I sent money regularly. Birthday gifts, Christmas packages, college fund contributions. Everything went through the Hamiltons' address, with instructions to give items to Emma. The Hamiltons sent thank you notes on Emma's behalf, explaining that she was busy with schoolwork, but appreciated my thoughtfulness. Looking back, I should have noticed that Emma's thank you notes were always typed, never handwritten. I should have questioned why my teenage daughter never called me directly, never sent text messages, never appeared on social media like every other kid her age. But I was building solar installations in remote parts of Africa, managing construction crews in political crisis zones, completely immersed in work that kept me from thinking about Margaret's empty chair at our dinner table. The overseas work was supposed to end in 2019, but opportunities kept extending the timeline. A desalination plant in Morocco, wind farm development in Chile. Each project paid better than the last, and I convinced myself that Emma was settled, happy, that disrupting her routine would be selfish. I was lying to myself, choosing money and avoidance over facing my responsibilities as a father. The pandemic made everything easier to avoid. Video calls were sporadic, always supervised by Patricia Hamilton. Emma looked tired in those calls, thinner, but everyone looked tired in 2020. The Hamiltons explained that she was working hard in her final year of high school, that she'd decided to take online college courses to save money. I should have known something was catastrophically wrong when Emma stopped asking when I was coming home. Last month, after completing what I'd decided would be my final international contract, I flew back to New Jersey without warning anyone. I'd bought a house in Princeton, planned to surprise Emma for her birthday, and hoped to rebuild our relationship gradually. I never called ahead because I wanted to see Emma's genuine reaction to my return. I'd imagined her running into my arms like she used to when she was little, excited about the gifts I'd brought and stories I could tell. Instead, I found my daughter on her knees, scrubbing marble floors in a maid's uniform, covered in bruises, living in what I would later discover was a converted garage apartment. The Hamiltons hadn't been caring for Emma out of charity. They'd been systematically exploiting her while intercepting the money I'd sent to support her. And Emma had been conditioned to believe that this was normal, that this was what she deserved, that this was the best life someone like her could expect. Standing in that marble foyer, watching my daughter flinch when she saw me, I realized that my 10-year absence hadn't just cost Emma her childhood. It had cost her the ability to believe that anyone would ever come to rescue her. But I was back now, and I was going to remind the Hamiltons that some mistakes have consequences that last longer than the people who make them. Emma dropped the scrub brush like it was on fire, and for one impossible moment, everything stopped. She was frozen on her knees in that ridiculous maid costume, staring at me like I was a ghost that had wandered into the wrong haunting. The vacuum cleaner kept running somewhere upstairs, and I could hear Patricia Hamilton's voice getting closer, still barking orders about dust and attention to detail. My daughter started to stand up, then seemed to remember something and immediately dropped back to her knees, head down, hands folded in her lap like she was praying. That's when I knew this wasn't just helping out the family that had taken her in. This was systematic, this was deliberate, and this had been going on for far too long. "Emma, what the hell is going on here?" I said, not bothering to keep my voice down. She flinched at my tone, actually flinched, and shot a terrified glance toward the staircase where Patricia's voice was getting louder. "Please, don't make trouble," Emma whispered. "Please, Dad, just leave. I can't talk to you when they're home." "Can't talk to me?" That phrase hit like a physical blow. My daughter was asking permission to speak to her own father. The butler reappeared, followed by a younger man who had to be one of the Hamilton children, all grown up now. He looked at Emma with casual contempt, then at me with mild annoyance, like I was a door-to-door salesman who'd gotten lost. "Ma'am," the butler called upstairs, "there's a gentleman here saying he knows Emma." "Saying he knows Emma?" I felt my jaw clench. "I'm her father." The Hamilton son looked genuinely surprised. "Emma's father? She told us her father died overseas years ago." "Emma told them I was dead." Or someone told Emma to say I was dead. Patricia Hamilton came down the stairs like she was making a royal entrance, wearing a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She saw me, and her expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, calculation, then something that looked like mild panic before settling on practiced authority. "Richard Patterson," she said, and the way she pronounced my name made it sound like something unpleasant she'd found on her shoe. "What an unexpected visit." "Where's Emma's room?" I said. Patricia glanced at Emma, still kneeling on the floor, then back at me. "Emma's living quarters are quite comfortable. She has everything she needs for her position." Position. Not family member, not daughter figure. Position. "Emma, stand up," I said. She started to rise, then froze when Patricia cleared her throat softly. "Emma has tasks to complete," Patricia said smoothly. "The floors won't clean themselves, and we're hosting a charity luncheon tomorrow. Perhaps you could schedule a visit in advance next time instead of disrupting the household routine." I looked at my daughter, still frozen in that half-standing position, waiting for permission to move freely in a house where she'd supposedly lived as family for 10 years. "Emma, get your things. You're coming home with me." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia's face went rigid. Emma looked terrified. "I'm afraid that's not possible," Patricia said, and now the pleasant mask was completely gone. "Emma is under our care through proper legal arrangements. We have documentation showing parental abandonment and our assumption of responsibility. Legal arrangements." My brain struggled to process what I was hearing. What documentation? I never signed any custody transfer. Patricia walked to a side table and retrieved a folder. "You signed a power of attorney, giving us authority over Emma's care in your absence. After 4 years without meaningful contact, and considering Emma's need for stability, we petitioned the family court for formal guardianship. 4 years. That timeline was more accurate, but still wrong. I'd maintained contact, sent money, tried to call regularly. The guardianship petition was news to me. I was never notified of any court proceedings. International notification can be complicated, especially when someone's work location changes frequently. The court made reasonable efforts to contact you at your last known address. That was possible, unfortunately. My work had taken me to remote locations where mail service was unreliable. But I'd given the Hamiltons my current contact information regularly. "I want to see this documentation immediately." Patricia hesitated. "Our attorney handles those matters. I can arrange for you to review everything with proper legal representation." She was stalling, which meant the documentation was either incomplete or fraudulent. Before I could respond, Emma spoke for the first time since I'd arrived. "Dad, please." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't make this harder for everyone. Don't make this harder." How could anything be harder than what I was witnessing? I knelt down to Emma's level, ignoring Patricia's sharp intake of breath. Up close, I could see more bruises, older ones fading to yellow-green on her collarbone. Someone had been hitting my daughter. Regularly. "Emma, honey, I'm taking you home. Right now." She started crying then, Silent tears that told me everything I needed to know about what happened when she made noise in this house. "I can't," she whispered. "They have papers. Mrs. Hamilton has my social security card, my birth certificate, everything. She says if I try to leave, she'll report me as a runaway and have me arrested for stealing household items." The final piece clicked into place. Patricia hadn't just been psychologically controlling Emma. She'd been holding her identification documents hostage. "Emma, you're 22 years old. You can't be arrested as a runaway. Mrs. Hamilton says I'm still legally their ward because of mental incapacity from grief and trauma." Emma's voice was getting smaller with each word. "She has medical documentation showing I need supervised care. Medical documentation showing mental incapacity." Patricia had been systematically building a legal framework to keep Emma trapped. I stood up slowly, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. 10 years of physical labor in dangerous locations had kept me in shape. 10 years of managing international projects had taught me how to read people, how to identify threats, how to plan strategic responses to complicated problems. Looking at Patricia Hamilton, I was seeing my first real threat assessment since returning to American soil. "Emma, go pack your belongings," I said quietly. "She can't leave without proper legal procedures," Patricia said. "We're responsible for her welfare." I pulled out my phone and started dialing. "Who are you calling?" Patricia demanded. "My attorney. The one who's been managing my affairs while I worked overseas. The one who's going to review whatever paperwork you used to steal custody of my child." Patricia's confident mask slipped slightly. "There's nothing fraudulent about properly filed legal documents." My attorney's office answered. "Morrison and Associates, this is Jenny." "Jenny, this is Richard Patterson. I need to speak to Jim Morrison immediately. Emergency." While I waited for Jim to pick up, I noticed Emma watching me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was little. Hope. Fragile, terrified hope. But hope, nonetheless. "Richard," Jim's voice came through the phone. "I thought you were still in Morocco. I'm back. Jim, I need you to meet me somewhere in the next hour. Bring everything related to Emma, and prepare to research guardianship laws regarding contested custody." "Contested custody? Richard, what's going on?" I looked at Emma in her maid uniform, looked at Patricia's frozen smile, looked at the butler and Hamilton's son watching this confrontation like it was dinner theater. "I think," I said slowly, "I've been systematically lied to for several years, and my daughter has been paying the price." The house phone rang, and Patricia moved to answer it. I heard her speaking in low, urgent tones to someone she called Charles. "We have a situation," she was saying. "Richard Patterson is here, making demands. You need to come home immediately." Charles Hamilton was being summoned for reinforcement, which meant Patricia wasn't confident she could handle this situation alone. That told me everything I needed to know about how much legal authority she actually possessed. Jim Morrison's law office felt like a sanctuary after the claustrophobic atmosphere of the Hamilton house. He'd agreed to meet us there within the hour, and Emma sat beside me in one of the leather chairs, still wearing her gray maid uniform because she'd been too afraid to take time to change clothes. She kept looking around the office like she'd never seen professional surroundings before, which made me wonder how isolated her world had become. "Emma," Jim said gently, "I need to ask you some direct questions about your living situation. Is that okay?" She nodded, but her hands were shaking. "Do you have access to your own identification documents?" "Mrs. Hamilton keeps everything in a safe. She says it's for security." "When did you last see a doctor or dentist who wasn't arranged by the Hamiltons?" "I don't remember. Mrs. Hamilton says I have a family doctor who makes house calls, but I only see him when I'm sick." Jim made notes, his expression growing darker with each answer. "Emma, do you receive any money for the work you do around the house?" "I get room and board. Mrs. Hamilton says that's more valuable than cash, because I don't have the skills to manage money responsibly." I watched Jim's face as he processed this information. As an attorney, He was recognizing patterns that went far beyond simple family dysfunction. "Richard," he said, "I've been researching the guardianship claim while you were driving here. There are some significant problems with the Hamiltons' documentation, such as they filed for temporary guardianship in 2018, citing parental abandonment and Emma's need for stability. But the notification process was incomplete." "How incomplete?" "They provided the court with an address in Guatemala from 2016, 2 years out of date. When the notice was returned as undeliverable, they claimed reasonable efforts had been made to contact you. But I'd given them my current contact information multiple times." "Exactly. Which means they deliberately provided outdated information to prevent you from receiving legal notice." "That was fraud, but it explained how they'd managed to get court approval for guardianship." "What about the medical documentation Patricia mentioned?" Jim's expression darkened further. "That's where things get interesting. The psychological evaluation was performed by Dr. Marcus Webb, who's since lost his license for fabricating mental health diagnoses in custody cases." Emma looked up sharply. "Dr. Webb? He came to the house once when I was 16. Mrs. Hamilton said it was a routine checkup, but he asked strange questions about my memory and concentration." "What kind of questions?" "Whether I felt confused about basic daily tasks, whether I could handle money, or make decisions independently." Mrs. Hamilton was in the room the whole time, and she kept giving me looks when I started to answer. I felt sick. Patricia had coached Emma through a fraudulent psychological evaluation designed to declare her mentally incompetent. "Jim, what are our legal options?" "The good news is that most of their documentation appears to be fraudulent or based on false information. The bad news is that Emma is now an adult, so we can't simply invalidate the guardianship and return her to your custody." "What does that mean?" "It means Emma has to choose to leave, and she has to be capable of making that choice freely. If the Hamiltons have convinced her she's mentally incompetent, or if they have evidence of stealing that they're using to threaten her, this becomes more complicated." Emma spoke quietly. "Mrs. Hamilton says she has bank records showing money missing from household accounts. She says if I ever try to leave, she'll have me arrested for theft." "Emma, do you know anything about missing money?" "No, I never had access to any accounts. But Mrs. Hamilton showed me printouts with my name on them, bank withdrawals that she said I'd made." Jim and I looked at each other. Fabricated evidence to prevent Emma from leaving. "That's classic coercive control," Jim said. "Create false evidence, threaten prosecution, convince the victim they have no options." "But here's what I don't understand," I said. "Why keep Emma specifically? Why not just send her to foster care or let her age out of the system?" "Because Emma wasn't just free labor," Jim said grimly. "I've been researching the Hamiltons' finances while you were driving here." He spread financial documents across his desk. "Charles Hamilton's law practice has been failing for years. Major clients left, several malpractice suits, significant financial losses. They've been hemorrhaging money since 2019. How does Emma factor into that? The money you've been sending for Emma's care has been directly deposited into their personal accounts. Over 10 years, that's approximately $250,000. The number hit like a physical blow. $250,000. But here's the interesting part. They've been claiming Emma as a dependent on their tax returns, receiving additional deductions for her care. Simultaneously, they've been billing the state for providing foster care services to Emma. They were triple-dipping: my money, tax deductions, and state payments. Exactly. Emma wasn't just free labor. She was a profit center. Emma had been listening to this conversation with growing horror. "They've been making money by keeping me? Substantial money," Jim confirmed, "which explains why they've gone to such elaborate lengths to prevent you from leaving." I thought about Patricia's panic when I'd shown up unannounced, her immediate claims of legal authority, the coached responses Emma had been taught to give to social workers. "Jim, what's our next move?" "First, we file for immediate review of the guardianship based on fraudulent documentation. Second, we involve adult protective services regarding financial exploitation and coercive control. Third, we document everything Emma can remember about the threats and false evidence. How long will that take? The legal process could take months, but Emma doesn't have to wait for the courts. As an adult, she can leave immediately if she chooses to. Emma looked at both of us. But what about the theft charges Mrs. Hamilton threatened? Emma, fabricated evidence isn't admissible in court. If Patricia tries to file charges, we'll demand to see the original bank records, verify the signatures, trace the transactions. Fraudulent evidence falls apart under investigation. But what if I'm wrong? What if I did something I don't remember? The psychological conditioning was deeper than I'd realized. Emma had been taught to doubt her own memory, to assume she was guilty of things she couldn't remember doing. Emma, I said gently, do you remember stealing money from the Hamiltons? No. Do you remember ever having access to their bank accounts? No. Do you remember ever being given permission to make financial transactions? No. Mrs. Hamilton always said I wasn't capable of handling money. Then you didn't steal anything. Patricia fabricated evidence to scare you into staying. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what we'd discovered. If I leave with you tonight, she said finally, what happens tomorrow? Tomorrow, you start learning how to live as a free adult. It won't be easy. You'll have to learn things that most people figure out gradually over years. But you'll be free to make mistakes, free to make choices, free to build the life you want. And what happens to the Hamiltons? Jim answered that question. They'll be investigated for fraud, financial exploitation, and coercive control of a vulnerable adult. They could face serious criminal charges. Emma looked out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere across town, Patricia and Charles Hamilton were probably planning their response to my reappearance. Destroying evidence, coaching their story, preparing to fight for their profitable arrangement. Dad, Emma said quietly, I want to go home with you. Are you sure? She looked at me with clear eyes for the first time since I'd returned. I'm sure. I don't know how to be a normal person yet, but I know I don't want to be their property anymore. I pulled Emma close, feeling her relax against me for the first time in 10 years. Tomorrow, we'd deal with the legal consequences and practical challenges of Emma's escape from systematic exploitation. But tonight, my daughter was coming home. That evening, I took Emma to a modest hotel near Princeton, while Jim Morrison prepared the legal filings we'd need to challenge the guardianship arrangement. Emma sat on the edge of one of the beds, still wearing the gray maid uniform, staring at her reflection in the television screen. Dad, she said quietly, I don't have any other clothes. That simple statement hit harder than all the legal complexities we'd discussed in Jim's office. My 22-year-old daughter owned nothing except the work uniform she was wearing. We'll fix that tomorrow, I said. Tonight, let's just focus on you being safe. Emma nodded, but I could see her mind working through practical anxieties that most people never have to consider. Where will I sleep? Wherever you want. Your own bed, your own room, your own choices about everything. I don't know how to make those kinds of decisions. You'll learn. Most people figure it out gradually. Emma walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot. Mrs. Hamilton always said I was too damaged from Mom's death to live independently, that I needed constant supervision and structure or I'd fall apart. The psychological manipulation ran deeper than I'd realized. Patricia had convinced Emma that grief had permanently broken her capacity for normal adult functioning. Emma, you've been managing complex household operations for years. You coordinated schedules, managed resources, solved problems under pressure. That requires significant capability, but that's just following instructions. Mrs. Hamilton always told me exactly what to do and when to do it. Who told Mrs. Hamilton how to organize a household for multiple children, manage social events, and coordinate with vendors? Emma considered that question. I guess she learned from experience. Right, and you can learn the same way. You do? The difference is that you'll be learning for your own benefit instead of someone else's. A knock at the door interrupted our conversation. Through the window, I could see Jim Morrison holding a folder and looking concerned. I opened the door, and Jim entered, his expression grim. "We have developments," he said. "The Hamiltons have moved faster than I expected." "What kind of developments?" Jim spread papers across the small hotel desk. "They've filed an emergency petition claiming that Emma is mentally unstable and has been kidnapped by an estranged father with no legal standing." Emma went pale. "Can they do that?" "They can file anything they want," Jim replied. "The question is whether a judge will take it seriously. They're asking for immediate police intervention to return Emma to their custody." I felt my blood pressure spike. Based on what evidence? They've provided the court with the psychological evaluation, claiming Emma has diminished capacity, plus affidavits from household staff claiming she's been acting erratically and expressing paranoid ideas about being exploited. Affidavits from household staff that they employ and control. Exactly. But a judge who doesn't understand the full situation might order a temporary return pending investigation. Emma stood up suddenly. "I should go back. If this causes legal problems for you, Dad, I'll just go back and—" "Emma, sit down." I used the firm tone I'd learned managing international construction crews. "You're not going back to people who've spent years exploiting you. But what if they arrest you for kidnapping?" "They won't, because kidnapping requires taking someone against their will. You're an adult who chose to leave with me." Jim nodded. "Richard's right. But Emma, you may need to speak directly to a judge tomorrow to confirm that you left voluntarily." "What would I need to say?" "The truth. That you're 22 years old, that you chose to leave with your father, that you weren't coerced or manipulated." Emma looked terrified. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if the judge thinks I'm too stupid to make my own decisions?" The conditioning was still controlling her thoughts. Emma genuinely believed she might be mentally deficient. "Emma," I said carefully, "you've been told for years that you're not smart enough to make decisions. But look at what you've actually accomplished. You managed a complex household, learned to anticipate and solve problems, maintained detailed schedules under pressure. Those are sophisticated skills. Mrs. Hamilton says that's just basic domestic work that anyone can do." Mrs. Hamilton was lying to keep you from recognizing your own capabilities. Think about it logically. If the work was so simple and anyone could do it, why didn't they hire someone else instead of going through elaborate legal maneuvers to keep you? Emma was quiet for a moment, working through that logic. "Because I was good at it," she said slowly. "And because I was free." "Right. And because you were too valuable to lose." Jim interrupted our conversation. "There's something else. I've been researching the other young women who lived with the Hamiltons over the years." "What did you find?" "Two of them have come forward since news of Emma's situation became known. They're willing to testify about similar exploitation." Emma looked up sharply. "Other women?" "Sarah Chen lived with the Hamiltons from age 15 to 19, 2008 to 2012. Maria Santos from age 16 to 21, 2012 to 2017. Both described the same pattern. Gradual transition from guest to ward to unpaid domestic worker." "What happened to them?" "Sarah aged out and was essentially discarded when she started questioning the arrangement. Maria escaped on her own, but was too afraid to report what happened because Patricia had threatened her with fabricated theft charges." Emma absorbed this information slowly. "So, I wasn't their first victim, or their last." Adult Protective Services believes there may be other families using similar methods to exploit vulnerable young women. "This is bigger than just Emma," I said. "Much bigger." Which is why Emma's testimony could be crucial, not just for her own case, but for exposing a wider pattern of exploitation. Emma walked back to the window, looking out at the night sky. "If I testify against the Hamiltons," she said, "will it help other women in similar situations?" "Potentially. Your case could set legal precedents for recognizing and prosecuting this type of coercive control." Emma was quiet for several minutes. When she spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been since I'd found her. Then I'll testify, not just for me, but for the other women they've hurt, and the women they might hurt in the future. I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with family loyalty and everything to do with recognizing genuine courage. Emma, you don't have to take on that responsibility. Yes, I do, she said firmly. Mrs. Hamilton spent years telling me I was worthless, that I was damaged, that I couldn't contribute anything meaningful to society. If my testimony helped stop this from happening to other women, then maybe she was wrong about everything. Jim began organizing his papers. I'll prepare the court response tonight. Tomorrow, we face the Hamiltons' emergency petition with our own evidence of fraud and exploitation. What happens if the judge orders Emma to return to their custody temporarily? Then we appeal immediately and request expedited review. But I don't think that's likely once the judge hears the full story. After Jim left, Emma and I sat quietly in the hotel room. She'd changed into clothes we'd bought at a nearby store, the first new clothing she'd owned in years that wasn't a work uniform. "Dad," she said, "I'm scared about tomorrow." "That's normal. You're about to confront people who controlled your life for years." "What if I freeze up? What if I can't find the words to explain what they did to me?" "Then you tell the truth simply. That you worked without pay, lived in isolated conditions, were threatened with false charges if you tried to leave. You don't need to be eloquent. You just need to be honest." Emma nodded, but I could see her anxiety building. "Emma, can I ask you something?" "Of course. How did you survive 10 years of that treatment without completely giving up hope?" She considered the question carefully. "I think part of me always knew it wasn't normal. I remembered how you and Mom treated me before she died, with respect and kindness. Mrs. Hamilton tried to make me forget that, but I held on to those memories." That night, I watched Emma sleep peacefully for the first time in years, while I stayed awake planning strategy for the legal battle ahead. Tomorrow, the Hamiltons would learn that their 10-year system of exploitation was about to become very public, very scrutinized, and very expensive. The county courthouse felt like a theater set for a drama neither Emma nor I had auditioned for. We sat in the hallway outside Judge Catherine Walsh's courtroom, waiting for the emergency hearing that would determine whether Emma would be forced to return to the Hamilton household. Emma wore a simple navy dress we'd bought the previous evening. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, and she kept glancing around at the other people waiting for their cases to be heard. "Dad," she whispered, "everyone here looks like they know what they're doing." "That's because most people don't have their family situations decided in courtrooms," I replied. "This isn't your fault, and you don't need to know courtroom procedures to tell the truth." Through the tall windows, I could see Charles and Patricia Hamilton arriving with what appeared to be an expensive legal team. Patricia walked with the confident stride of someone who'd never doubted her authority to control other people's lives. Jim Morrison appeared beside us, carrying a briefcase and looking professionally calm. "How are we looking?" I asked. "Better than expected. Judge Walsh has reviewed our preliminary filings and requested to speak with Emma privately before the hearing." "What does that mean?" "It means she wants to assess Emma's mental state and decision-making capacity without outside influence." "It's actually a positive development." Emma looked nervous. "What should I say to her?" "The truth. Judge Walsh is experienced with family exploitation cases. She'll ask straightforward questions, and you should give straightforward answers." 20 minutes later, Emma was called into Judge Walsh's chambers. I watched my daughter walk through that door with more composure than I would have managed in her situation. While we waited, I observed the Hamilton legal team through the courtroom windows. 3 attorneys in expensive suits, several assistants, and what looked like a private investigator reviewing documents. They'd mobilized significant resources very quickly. "They're treating this like a major corporate lawsuit," I told Jim, "because they understand what's at stake. If Emma's testimony exposes their operation, they're facing criminal charges and civil liability that could destroy them financially." What about the other victims, Sarah and Maria? Both are prepared to testify if needed. Sarah is driving down from Boston, and Maria flew in from Denver last night. After 30 minutes, Emma emerged from the judge's chambers looking relieved rather than traumatized. "How did it go?" I asked. "She was nice." She asked about my living situation, my work responsibilities, whether I felt capable of making my own decisions. I told her everything. Everything? About the garage apartment, the work schedule, Mrs. Hamilton keeping my documents, the threats about theft charges. Everything. Jim looked satisfied. That's exactly what we needed. The courtroom doors opened, and we were called inside for the formal hearing. Emma sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, facing the Hamilton legal team across the aisle. Judge Walsh was a middle-aged woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She reviewed the paperwork before her with careful attention. "This court is here to address an emergency petition claiming that Miss Emma Patterson has been unlawfully removed from legal guardianship," she began. "However, based on my preliminary review and conversation with Miss Patterson, there appear to be significant questions about the validity and circumstances of that guardianship." Charles Hamilton's attorney, a man named David Fletcher, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, our client has provided legal care and supervision for Miss Patterson for over 6 years. Her father abandoned her to pursue work overseas, and she has developed significant psychological dependency on the structure and support our clients provide." Judge Walsh looked at Fletcher with mild skepticism. "Mr. Fletcher, Miss Patterson is 22 years old. What legal authority allows your clients to control an adult's living arrangements? Miss Patterson has documented mental health challenges stemming from childhood trauma. She requires supervised care for her own safety and welfare." "I see. And this supervision involves what specific living arrangements?" Fletcher hesitated slightly. "Miss Patterson resides in comfortable quarters on our client's property and contributes to household management in exchange for room, board, and supervision." "Contributes to household management? How?" "Various domestic tasks appropriate to her capabilities." Judge Walsh turned to Jim Morrison. "Mr. Morrison, how would you characterize Miss Patterson's living arrangements?" "Forced labor, Your Honor. Miss Patterson worked approximately 14 hours per day, 7 days per week, for no compensation beyond basic room and board in a garage apartment. She was denied access to her identification documents, threatened with prosecution on fabricated charges if she attempted to leave, and psychologically conditioned to believe she was incapable of independent living." The courtroom was completely quiet. Judge Walsh looked directly at Emma. "Miss Patterson, I'd like you to describe your typical daily routine while living with the Hamilton family." Emma stood slowly, her voice clear despite obvious nervousness. "I woke up at 5:30 every morning to prepare breakfast for the family. After serving breakfast and cleaning the kitchen, I would begin house cleaning tasks: vacuuming, dusting, bathroom cleaning, laundry. I served lunch and dinner, cleaned up afterward, and prepared meal plans for the following day. I worked until approximately 9 o'clock each evening, 7 days per week." "Did you receive any compensation for this work?" "Room and board. Mrs. Hamilton explained that this was more valuable than money because I lacked the skills to manage finances responsibly." "Did you have any time off from these duties?" "No, Your Honor. Mrs. Hamilton said that idle time would allow me to develop unhealthy ideas about independence that would be harmful to my psychological stability." Judge Walsh made notes, then looked at the Hamilton legal team. "Mr. Fletcher, does your client dispute Miss Patterson's description of her daily routine?" Fletcher consulted quickly with Charles Hamilton before responding. "Your Honor, Miss Patterson was provided with valuable work experience and life skills training. The structure was therapeutic, designed to help her develop self-discipline and purpose. Therapeutic work that lasted 14 hours daily for 6 years without compensation? Miss Patterson received substantial benefit: housing, food, medical care, and supervision by qualified caregivers. Judge Walsh's expression suggested she was not impressed by this argument. Mr. Fletcher, I've reviewed the psychological evaluation used to support your client's guardianship petition. It was performed by Dr. Marcus Webb, who has since lost his license for fabricating mental health diagnoses in custody cases. Fletcher looked genuinely surprised, which told me he hadn't been informed about the fraudulent evaluation. Your Honor, my clients acted in good faith based on professional medical advice. Perhaps, but the evaluation is now inadmissible, which undermines the entire basis for the guardianship order. Judge Walsh turned back to Emma. Miss Patterson, do you feel capable of making your own decisions about where to live and how to support yourself? Yes, Your Honor. I understand that I have a lot to learn about independent living, but I believe I can learn these skills with appropriate support. Do you feel safe with your father? Yes, Your Honor. I feel safer with him than I've felt in years. Do you choose to live with your father rather than returning to the Hamilton household? Yes, Your Honor. Absolutely. Judge Walsh made final notes, then looked up at both legal teams. Based on my review of the evidence and my conversation with Miss Patterson, I find that she is a competent adult capable of making her own decisions about her living arrangements. The guardianship order appears to have been based on fraudulent medical evaluation and may have been obtained through deliberate misrepresentation to the court. She turned to the Hamilton legal team. Mr. Fletcher, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into the circumstances surrounding the original guardianship petition. If evidence of fraud is confirmed, your clients may face criminal charges. Your Honor, Fletcher said desperately, surely this matter can be resolved through family mediation rather than criminal proceedings. Mr. Fletcher, if the allegations are accurate, your clients have been exploiting a vulnerable young woman for years while stealing money meant for her care. That's not a family dispute. That's organized criminal activity. Judge Walsh signed an order terminating the guardianship and dismissing the Hamilton emergency petition. Miss Patterson, you are free to live wherever you choose. Mr. Patterson, I'm recommending that Adult Protective Services investigate this situation thoroughly. As we left the courtroom, I could hear David Fletcher urgently conferring with the Hamilton legal team about damage control and criminal defense strategies. Emma walked beside me with her head held high for the first time since I'd returned from overseas. Dad, she said quietly, I think Mrs. Hamilton was wrong about me being too damaged to live independently. She was wrong about a lot of things. Outside the courthouse, Emma looked up at the bright afternoon sky like she was seeing it clearly for the first time in years. What happens now? Now you get to find out who you are when no one is controlling your choices. I'm scared, she said. But I'm also excited. That sounds like the perfect combination for starting a new life. 2 weeks later, Emma and I were sitting in our modest rental house in Princeton, surrounded by college brochures and apartment listings. The transition to normal life was harder than either of us had anticipated, but Emma was learning to make decisions about everything from what to eat for breakfast to what television shows to watch. Small choices that most people never think about, but each one represented freedom she'd been denied for years. The phone rang, and I recognized Detective Sarah Brennan's number. Mr. Patterson, we've completed the initial investigation into the Hamilton situation. I'd like to update you and Emma on our findings. Good news or bad news? Mixed. Can you and Emma come to the station this afternoon? An hour later, we sat in Detective Brennan's office reviewing evidence that painted an even grimmer picture than we'd originally understood. The financial investigation confirms that Charles and Patricia Hamilton systematically stole approximately $270,000 in money you sent for Emma's care, Detective Brennan explained. They also defrauded the state of New Jersey for foster care payments and claimed fraudulent tax deduction. What about the other victims? Sarah Chen and Maria Santos have provided detailed statements confirming similar patterns of exploitation. We've identified 2 additional women who lived with the Hamiltons briefly, but left before establishing clear evidence of abuse. Emma spoke for the first time since we'd arrived. 5 women total? At least 5. We believe there may be others who haven't come forward yet. Detective Brennan spread photographs across her desk. We executed a search warrant on the Hamilton property yesterday. These are what we found. The photos showed a converted garage apartment with minimal furnishing, no kitchen facilities, and a small bathroom with basic fixtures. Emma's quarters looked like accommodations for livestock rather than human habitation. "This is where I lived," Emma said quietly, studying the photos. "I always thought other people's rooms looked different, but Mrs. Hamilton said I was imagining things." Other photos showed a basement room with file cabinets containing detailed records on all 5 women who'd lived with the Hamiltons over 15 years. They kept records on everyone, Detective Brennan continued. Work schedules, behavioral observations, financial calculations showing profit margins for each victim. Profit margins? They treated it like a business operation. Your money for Emma's care, plus state payments, plus tax deductions, minus minimal costs for food and shelter. Emma generated approximately $32,000 per year in net profit. The calculation was horrifying. Emma had been reduced to a line item in a profit and loss statement. "Detective Brennan," Emma said, "what happens to the Hamiltons now? They're facing multiple federal charges: mail fraud, wire fraud, financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, and conspiracy. If convicted, they could receive significant prison sentences. When will the trial begin? That depends on several factors. Charles Hamilton's attorney is exploring plea agreement options. Patricia Hamilton is insisting on fighting all charges." I wasn't surprised. Patricia Hamilton struck me as someone who genuinely believed she'd done nothing wrong. What would Emma's role be in a trial? Critical. Emma would be the primary victim witness, testifying about the conditions of her exploitation and the psychological manipulation she experienced. Emma looked nervous. "What would I need to say? The truth about your daily routine, the threats you received, the isolation you experienced. Your testimony would help the jury understand the systematic nature of what the Hamiltons did. Would I have to face them in court?" "Yes, but we'd provide victim support services and arrange for psychological preparation." Emma was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. "Detective Brennan, would my testimony help prevent this from happening to other women?" "Absolutely. High-profile prosecution of this type of exploitation could lead to stronger legal protections and increased awareness among social services." "Then I'll testify." "Emma," I said, "you don't have to put yourself through that stress. Dad, Mrs. Hamilton spent years telling me I was worthless and couldn't contribute anything meaningful to society. If my testimony helps protect other women from what happened to me, then she was wrong." Detective Brennan nodded approvingly. "Emma, your courage could make a real difference." After we left the police station, Emma and I stopped for coffee at a small cafe near the university. She'd been visiting campus regularly, working with an educational counselor to prepare for college enrollment. "Dad, I've been thinking about what I want to study. What are you considering?" "Social work, with a focus on adult protective services. I want to help people in situations like mine." I felt proud of Emma's choice, but also concerned about the psychological burden she might be taking on. That's meaningful work, but it could be emotionally difficult. "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of career?" "I've survived the worst version of the problems I'd be helping other people solve. Mrs. Hamilton tried to break me, but she accidentally taught me that I'm stronger than I thought." "What do you mean?" "I endured years of psychological manipulation while maintaining my core sense of right and wrong. I survived isolation while holding on to hope that things could be better. If I can do that, I can handle helping other people through similar challenges." Emma was developing a perspective on her experiences that transformed survival into strength, trauma into purpose. "Besides," she continued, "I understand what it feels like to believe you're worthless and have no options. That understanding could help me connect with other victims in ways that people with normal backgrounds might not be able to." That evening, Emma called Sarah Chen, the first woman who'd lived with the Hamiltons. They talked for over 2 hours, comparing experiences and supporting each other through the emotional process of confronting their shared trauma. Sarah is studying psychology now, Emma told me afterward. She says testifying against the Hamiltons was the hardest thing she'd ever done, but also the most liberating. How so? Because it forced them to face consequences for what they did, and it proved to her that she was strong enough to stand up to people who'd controlled her. I watched Emma throughout these conversations and saw someone who was transforming her worst experiences into the foundation for her life's work. 3 weeks later, Emma received her acceptance letter to Rutgers University with a full scholarship funded by restitution money from the Hamilton case. She'd also been offered a part-time position with a local nonprofit organization that helped women transition out of exploitative situations. "Dad," she said, reading the acceptance letter, "I think this is what I'm supposed to do with my life." "What's that?" "Turn what happened to me into something that helps other people." Mrs. Hamilton thought she was teaching me to be a servant, but she actually taught me to recognize injustice and fight it. That night, I watched Emma make dinner in our kitchen, something she'd chosen to cook because she enjoyed it rather than because someone had ordered her to do it. Simple activity, but it represented the fundamental difference between slavery and freedom. The right to choose your own actions for your own reasons. Emma was learning to use that right thoughtfully, deliberately, with full awareness of how precious it was because she remembered what life was like without it. Outside our kitchen window, autumn leaves were falling in Princeton, New Jersey, covering the ground with bright colors that would eventually decompose into soil for new growth. Emma's 10-year ordeal was decomposing into wisdom, strength, and purpose that would nurture other people's recovery from similar trauma. That seemed like the best possible transformation of the worst possible experience. 4 months later, I sat in the gallery of the federal courthouse watching my daughter testify in the criminal trial of Patricia Hamilton. Charles had accepted a plea agreement and received 7 years in federal prison, but Patricia had insisted on fighting all charges. Emma wore a burgundy suit that she'd chosen herself, her hair pulled back in a professional style that made her look confident and composed. She'd been working with a victim advocate for weeks, preparing for this moment. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Rodriguez, approached Emma with gentle professionalism. "Miss Patterson, can you describe your living conditions while residing with the Hamilton family?" Emma's voice was clear and steady as she walked the jury through the details of her daily routine: the isolated garage apartment, the constant work requirements, and the gradual erosion of her contact with the outside world. She explained how the psychological manipulation had worked systematically over years, beginning with reasonable requests for help and gradually expanding into total control over her life. "Miss Patterson," the prosecutor continued, "did you ever attempt to leave the Hamilton household?" "Yes, once, when I was 19. I asked Mrs. Hamilton about getting my own apartment and finding outside employment. What was her response? She showed me bank statements that she claimed proved I had been stealing money from household accounts. She said if I ever tried to leave, she would have me arrested for theft." "Did you believe these accusations?" "I didn't remember stealing anything, but Mrs. Hamilton said that memory problems were part of my psychological damage from my mother's death. She convinced me that I might have done things I couldn't remember." The courtroom was completely quiet, as Emma described years of gaslighting designed to make her doubt her own perceptions and memories. "Miss Patterson, what prevented you from contacting your father directly?" "Mrs. Hamilton told me that my father had started a new life overseas and didn't want contact with me. She said attempting to reach him would be cruel and selfish, that it would burden him with problems he'd moved on from." "Did you believe that?" "I wanted to believe it wasn't true, but I had no way to verify it. I wasn't allowed unsupervised internet access. I didn't have a phone, and Mrs. Hamilton monitored all communication." Patricia Hamilton's defense attorney, Robert Chen, approached for cross-examination with the strategy Detective Brennan had predicted. "Miss Patterson, Isn't it true that you could have left the Hamilton residence at any time after your 18th birthday? Where would I have gone? Emma replied calmly. I had no identification documents, no money, no outside relationships, and no knowledge of how to navigate basic adult responsibilities. But you had access to public resources, libraries, social services, community organizations. Mr. Chen, when was the last time you tried to access social services without identification documents, without a permanent address, and without any understanding of how those systems work? The question caught him off guard. Emma had learned to turn cross-examination tactics into opportunities to educate the jury about the realities of her situation. Miss Patterson, didn't the Hamiltons provide you with valuable work experience and life skills? Emma paused, looked directly at Patricia Hamilton, and delivered an answer that would be quoted in news coverage for weeks. They provided me with experience in surviving psychological abuse and skills for recognizing manipulation. I don't consider those valuable additions to anyone's resume. The jury looked disturbed by Emma's calm assessment of her exploitation. Miss Patterson, the Hamiltons fed you, housed you, and provided medical care for over 10 years. Doesn't that demonstrate genuine care for your welfare? Mr. Chen, slave owners also fed and housed their property. Basic survival needs aren't proof of benevolent treatment when they're provided in exchange for uncompensated labor and total control over someone's life. The slavery comparison landed with devastating impact. Several jurors looked directly at Patricia Hamilton with obvious disgust. When Emma finished testifying, she walked back to the gallery and sat beside me. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her expression was proud rather than traumatized. "How did I do?" she whispered. "Perfect." I whispered back, "You were perfect." The prosecution called Sarah Chen and Maria Santos, who provided testimony confirming the pattern of exploitation that had affected multiple victims over 15 years. Sarah, now 26, and working as a psychology researcher in Boston, described how the Hamiltons had gradually isolated her from family and friends while increasing her work responsibilities. Maria, 25 and living in Denver, testified about the fraudulent theft charges that Patricia had used to threaten her into compliance, identical to the tactics used against Emma. The defense strategy became clear as the trial progressed. Patricia's attorneys were arguing that she genuinely believed she was providing charitable care to psychologically damaged young women who needed structure and supervision. They presented character witnesses who described Patricia's charitable work with local organizations and her reputation for helping troubled youth. But the prosecution had financial records showing the systematic profit calculations, the intercepted payments meant for the victim's care, and the fraudulent documentation used to maintain control. When Patricia took the stand in her own defense, she maintained that she'd been providing therapeutic structure for young women who couldn't function independently. Emma Patterson was severely damaged by her mother's death and her father's abandonment, Patricia testified. She needed constant supervision and meaningful work to prevent her from falling into destructive behaviors. Mrs. Hamilton, the prosecutor asked during cross-examination, did Emma ever express a desire for education beyond high school? Emma wasn't academically capable of higher education. Her psychological limitations made such goals unrealistic. Did you ever have Emma evaluated by licensed educational professionals to assess her academic capabilities? It wasn't necessary. Her daily functioning made her limitations obvious. Mrs. Hamilton, Emma scored in the 95th percentile on her college entrance exams. How do you reconcile that with your assessment of her academic limitations? Patricia's composure cracked slightly. Test scores don't reflect real-world capabilities. What professional qualifications do you have to assess someone's educational potential? I have 15 years of experience working with troubled young women. You have 15 years of experience exploiting vulnerable women for profit, don't you? Patricia's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Under pressure, Patricia had revealed her fundamental belief that the women she'd exploited were inherently inferior and deserved the treatment they'd received. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Patricia Hamilton guilty on all charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and trafficking in persons for forced labor. At sentencing 6 weeks later, Emma read a victim impact statement she'd written herself. "Your Honor, Patricia Hamilton stole 10 years of my life, but she failed to steal my future. She tried to convince me that I was worthless, that I deserved nothing better than servitude, that I should be grateful for exploitation." Emma looked directly at Patricia, who sat at the defense table with her head down. "I'm 23 years old now, starting my sophomore year of college, with a 3.8 GPA. I'm studying social work because I want to help other women recognize and escape from situations like mine." Patricia Hamilton thought she was training me to be a servant, but she actually taught me to identify injustice and fight it. Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Patricia Hamilton will serve her prison sentence and eventually be released. But the women she exploited will carry the effects of her manipulation for the rest of our lives. The difference is that we've learned to transform our survival into service for others. Patricia Hamilton destroyed our childhoods, but she accidentally gave us the strength and motivation to protect other women from experiencing what we experienced." Judge Michael Torres sentenced Patricia to 15 years in federal prison and ordered full restitution to all victims. Outside the courthouse, Emma was interviewed by journalists covering the case as an example of modern trafficking in domestic situations. "Emma," one reporter asked, "what do you want people to understand about situations like yours? That they're more common than most people realize. That wealthy families sometimes exploit vulnerable women through legal manipulation and psychological control, and that victims survive by maintaining hope that someone, eventually, will care enough to help them escape." What would you say to women who might be in similar situations right now? That you deserve better than you're receiving. That the people who tell you you're incapable of independence are usually the people who benefit from your dependence. And that recovery is possible if you're brave enough to accept help when it's offered. That evening, Emma and I had dinner at our favorite restaurant in Princeton. She'd become comfortable making choices about everything from food to entertainment, and I watched her navigate social interactions with growing confidence. "Dad, I've been thinking about something," she said over dessert. "What's that?" "I want to thank you." "For what?" "For coming back. For believing I deserved better than what the Hamiltons were giving me. For fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself." I felt my throat tighten. "Emma, I should have come back sooner. I should never have left you in a situation where that kind of exploitation was possible." "Maybe. But you did come back, and you didn't give up when things got complicated. That's what matters." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Besides, if none of this had happened, I wouldn't have learned what I learned about strength and resilience. I might never have discovered that I want to spend my life helping other people escape from similar situations." "So you're saying the worst thing that ever happened to you was also somehow meaningful?" Emma considered that carefully. "I'm saying that terrible experiences can create opportunities to become someone stronger and more compassionate than you might have been otherwise. Patricia Hamilton tried to break me, but she accidentally taught me that I'm almost impossible to break." 2 years later, Emma graduated summa cum laude from Rutgers with a degree in social work. She'd also completed an internship with the FBI's Human Trafficking Unit and had been offered a position with a nonprofit organization that specialized in identifying and prosecuting modern slavery operations. The night before graduation, she called me from her apartment. "Dad, I got the job offer from the Coalition Against Human Trafficking." "That's wonderful. Are you going to accept?" "I think so, but I wanted to ask you something first." "Anything. Are you proud of who I've become?" I thought about my daughter's journey from exploitation to education to advocacy, her transformation of trauma into purpose. her decision to use her worst experiences as the foundation for protecting other people. Emma, I've never been more proud of anyone in my life. Good, she said. Because I finally understand what Mrs. Hamilton got wrong about me. What's that? She thought breaking someone would make them weaker. But sometimes breaking someone just teaches them that they're strong enough to put themselves back together. Emma had not only survived 10 years of systematic exploitation, she'd transformed that survival into the beginning of a career dedicated to ensuring that other women wouldn't have to endure what she'd endured. That seemed like the most complete victory possible over people who'd tried to convince her she was worthless. Patricia Hamilton had spent 10 years trying to break my daughter's spirit. Instead, she'd accidentally forged it into something unbreakable. 3 years after Patricia Hamilton's sentencing, I received a call that brought the entire experience full circle in ways I hadn't expected. Emma was in her final semester of graduate school, specializing in trauma recovery and victim advocacy, when Detective Brennan called with news that would test everything Emma had learned about forgiveness and justice. "Mr. Patterson, we've discovered something that changes our understanding of the Hamilton case," Detective Brennan said. "Can you and Emma come to the station? This affects both of you directly." An hour later, we sat in the familiar conference room where Emma had first given her statement years earlier. Detective Brennan spread new documents across the table. "We've been investigating similar exploitation cases in other states, following leads from Emma's testimony. What we found suggests the Hamilton operation was part of a much larger network." "What kind of network?" Emma asked. "Wealthy families sharing information about recruitment, control techniques, and legal strategies for exploiting vulnerable women. The Hamiltons were essentially franchisees in a system that's been operating for over 20 years. The implications were staggering. Emma's case hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of an organized operation affecting dozens of women across multiple states. How many victims are we talking about?" "At least 47 women in 8 states. Possibly more as the investigation continues." Emma absorbed this information quietly. "Detective Brennan, does this mean Patricia Hamilton might be released early to cooperate with the larger investigation?" "That's what I need to discuss with you. The federal prosecutors are offering Patricia a reduced sentence in exchange for providing information about the network's leadership and operational methods." I felt my blood pressure spike. After what she did to Emma, they want to give her a deal? The information Patricia could provide might help us shut down the entire network and rescue women who are currently being exploited. Emma spoke before I could object further. "What exactly would Patricia have to do to earn this reduced sentence?" "Full cooperation with federal investigators, testimony against network leaders, and participation in educational programs designed to help law enforcement recognize similar operations." "And what would her actual sentence be?" "Approximately 8 years instead of 15, with supervised probation and community service focused on victim advocacy." The idea of Patricia Hamilton working in victim advocacy seemed obscenely ironic, but Emma was considering it with clinical detachment. "Detective Brennan, have any current victims been identified through this investigation?" "Yes. We've located 12 women currently living in situations identical to what you experienced." Emma was quiet for several minutes, working through the complex emotional and practical considerations. "Dad," she said finally, "what do you think about the plea arrangement?" "I think Patricia Hamilton deserves to serve her full sentence for what she did to you and the other women. I understand that. But if her cooperation could help 12 women escape situations like mine, doesn't that obligation outweigh personal satisfaction from her punishment?" I looked at my daughter, now 26 years old, and completing graduate studies in victim advocacy, approaching this decision with the kind of moral clarity that came from transforming personal trauma into professional purpose. "Emma, this is your decision. You're the one who suffered the most from Patricia's actions. That's exactly why I have to think beyond my own feelings. If I've learned anything from this experience, it's that individual recovery matters less than preventing future victims." Emma turned to Detective Brennan. What would my role be if Patricia accepts this plea agreement? You'd be involved in developing the educational materials used to train law enforcement. Your experiences would help investigators understand the psychological manipulation techniques used by these networks. Would I have to interact directly with Patricia? Not necessarily, but your input would be valuable for assessing the authenticity of her cooperation. Emma asked for time to consider the decision. That evening, we sat in her apartment near the university, discussing the moral complexity of offering leniency to someone who'd caused so much harm. Dad, I keep thinking about something Patricia said during her trial. What's that? She claimed she genuinely believed she was helping damaged women who couldn't function independently. What if part of that was true? Emma, she exploited you for profit. Nothing about that was helpful, I know. But what if she convinced herself it was helpful because she'd been taught the same attitudes about women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds? I was startled by Emma's capacity for psychological analysis of her former abuser. You're suggesting Patricia was a product of systemic attitudes about class and exploitation? I'm suggesting that understanding why people become perpetrators might be necessary for preventing future victims. If Patricia's cooperation could help law enforcement recognize these networks earlier, then her redemption becomes less important than her utility. The next morning, Emma called Detective Brennan with her decision. I support the plea agreement, but with conditions, she said. Patricia's cooperation must be verified through successful prosecution of network leaders and documented rescue of current victims. If her information proves inaccurate or incomplete, the original sentence should be reinstated. Those conditions are reasonable and likely acceptable to prosecutors. There's something else. I want to be involved in developing the educational materials, and I want to interview Patricia directly to assess her psychological transformation. Detective Brennan looked surprised. Emma, are you sure you want that kind of direct contact? I need to understand whether she's genuinely changed or simply providing strategic cooperation. That assessment could be crucial for preventing her from reoffending. 6 months later, I accompanied Emma to the Federal Correctional Facility, where Patricia Hamilton was serving her sentence. Emma had spent weeks preparing for this encounter, working with psychologists to develop interview techniques that would reveal Patricia's authentic attitudes. Patricia looked older and smaller than I remembered from the trial. Prison had aged her significantly, and she no longer carried the entitled authority that had defined her interactions with Emma years earlier. Emma, Patricia said when we entered the interview room, I didn't expect you to visit. I'm here to assess your cooperation with federal investigators, Emma replied professionally. Your reduced sentence depends partly on my evaluation of your psychological changes. Patricia looked genuinely surprised by Emma's clinical approach. I've been participating in therapy programs, learning about the psychological damage I caused, Patricia said. I understand now that what I did was wrong. What specifically do you understand was wrong about it? I convinced myself that I was helping you when I was actually exploiting you for financial gain. Emma made notes on a legal pad, her expression neutral. Mrs. Hamilton, do you believe I was genuinely incapable of independent living when I was 22 years old? Patricia hesitated. I believed it at the time, but I understand now that I created that incapacity through psychological manipulation. What do you understand about the effects of your manipulation on my psychological development? I damaged your self-confidence and taught you to doubt your own capabilities. I created learned helplessness that took years for you to overcome. Emma's questioning continued for 2 hours, methodically exploring Patricia's understanding of the harm she'd caused and her genuine commitment to preventing similar exploitation. When we left the prison, Emma was quiet during the drive back to Princeton. How do you think it went? I asked. She understands intellectually what she did wrong, but I don't think she feels genuine remorse. She's participating in the cooperation agreement because it benefits her, not because she's been psychologically transformed. Does that change your support for the plea arrangement? No. Her personal redemption isn't the point. If her information helps rescue current victims and prosecute network leaders, then the practical benefits outweigh concerns about her authentic repentance. Over the following year, Patricia's cooperation led to the identification and dismantling of exploitation networks in 6 states. 32 women were rescued from situations identical to Emma's, and 14 wealthy families faced criminal prosecution. Emma's educational materials became the standard training resource for law enforcement agencies learning to recognize domestic trafficking operations. Patricia Hamilton served 8 years and was released on supervised probation with requirements for community service in victim advocacy programs. The irony of Patricia working to help exploitation victims was not lost on anyone involved in the case. "Dad," Emma said after Patricia's release, "I've been thinking about what justice actually means." "What do you think it means?" "I used to think justice meant punishment that matched the crime. But watching this network investigation, I think justice might mean preventing future crimes more than punishing past ones." "Are you satisfied with Patricia's sentence?" "I'm satisfied with the results of her cooperation. 32 women are free because of information she provided. That matters more than her personal suffering in prison." Emma had developed a perspective on justice that prioritized prevention over retribution, recovery over revenge. 6 months after Patricia's release, Emma received an unexpected phone call. "This is Patricia Hamilton. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I think about what I did to you every day." Emma put the call on speaker so I could hear the conversation. "What specifically do you think about?" "How I stole 10 years of your life and tried to convince you that you deserved nothing better. How I used your grief about your mother to manipulate you into accepting exploitation." "Why are you calling me now?" "Because I'm working with women who escaped from situations like yours, and every time I try to help them recover, I'm reminded of the damage I caused you." Emma was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "Mrs. Hamilton, I hope your work with other victims is genuine and helpful, but I need you to understand that your guilt is not my responsibility to resolve. I understand that. I just wanted you to know that your testimony and your recovery have been more powerful than any punishment I received in prison." "How so?" "Watching you transform what I did to you into a career helping other women showed me what strength actually looks like. I spent years thinking I was strong because I could control other people. You showed me that real strength means using your worst experiences to protect other people from similar harm." After Patricia hung up, Emma sat quietly for several minutes. "How do you feel about that call?" I asked. "Confused," Emma admitted. "Part of me wants to believe she's genuinely changed, and part of me thinks she's still trying to manipulate me. What does your professional training tell you? That change is possible but rare, and that my emotional need for her redemption shouldn't influence my assessment of her authenticity. What does your personal instinct tell you?" Emma smiled slightly. "That it doesn't matter whether she's changed or not. I've changed, and that's what actually matters." 3 years later, Emma was appointed director of the Federal Task Force on Domestic Trafficking, the youngest person ever to hold that position. Her work had led to the identification of over 200 victims and the prosecution of 47 exploitation networks. Patricia Hamilton continued working in victim services under court supervision, and by all accounts, her contributions were meaningful and helpful. But Emma had moved beyond needing Patricia's redemption to validate her own recovery. "Dad," Emma said during one of our monthly dinners, "I realized something important about forgiveness." "What's that?" "Forgiveness isn't about the other person deserving it. It's about refusing to let their actions continue controlling your emotional life." "So, you've forgiven Patricia?" "I've released my need for her to suffer as payment for what she did to me. Whether that's forgiveness or just psychological freedom, I'm not sure, but I'm free from needing anything from her." Emma had achieved something more complete than justice or revenge. the ability to use her survival as the foundation for protecting other people, regardless of what happened to the person who'd initially harmed her. That seemed like the most complete victory possible over someone who'd tried to convince her she was powerless. 5 years later, Emma was testifying before Congress about gaps in federal legislation protecting vulnerable adults from domestic trafficking when her phone buzzed with a message that would force her to confront the final piece of her recovery journey. The text came from an unknown number. "Emma, this is Sarah Chen from the Hamilton case. I know this is unexpected, but I'm reaching out to all the survivors. Patricia Hamilton died yesterday in a car accident. I thought you should know. Call me if you want to talk." Emma finished her congressional testimony
I could see the
with her
news had
usual
affected her
professional
deeply.
composure. During the break, she called Sarah from a quiet corridor in the Capitol building. "Sarah, how do you feel about Patricia's death?" "Honestly? Relieved. I know that sounds awful, but knowing she can never hurt anyone else again gives me peace I didn't realize I needed." "I don't think it sounds awful. I think it sounds honest. How do you feel about it?" Emma was quiet for a moment. "Empty, I think. I spent so many years building my life in response to what she did to me that her death feels like losing a reference point." "What do you mean?" "I became someone who helps other people partly to prove that Patricia was wrong about me being worthless. If she's gone, do I need to keep proving that?" Sarah understood immediately. "Emma, you've spent 15 years becoming someone Patricia could never have imagined. You don't need her existence to validate your achievements." That evening, Emma and I had dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Potomac River. She'd been unusually quiet since receiving the news about Patricia's death. "Dad, can I ask you something that might sound strange?" "Of course. Do you think I'll miss having Patricia Hamilton as the person I was trying to prove wrong?" The question was more psychologically sophisticated than I'd expected. "What do you mean?" "I built my entire adult identity around overcoming what she did to me and helping other women do the same. If she's gone, do I lose the motivation that's driven me for the past decade?" "Emma, do you help trafficking victims because you want to prove Patricia wrong, or because you genuinely care about their welfare?" "Both, I think. And I'm not sure how to separate those motivations." "Maybe you don't need to separate them. Maybe Patricia's impact on your life was the catalyst for discovering who you really are. And now you know who that person is independent of her existence." Emma considered that perspective. "You think I've outgrown needing her as an opponent? I think you've become someone who would care about exploitation and injustice regardless of your personal history with it." 2 weeks later, Emma attended Patricia Hamilton's funeral. Not out of forgiveness or sentiment, but from professional curiosity about who else would attend and what it might reveal about networks they hadn't yet identified. The service was small and sparsely attended. Charles Hamilton, recently released from federal prison, sat alone in the front row. A few former clients and charitable acquaintances filled scattered seats throughout the small chapel. Emma sat in the back, observing but not participating in the formal ceremonies. During the brief eulogy, the minister spoke about Patricia's charitable work and community involvement without mentioning the criminal activities that had defined the last decade of her life. After the service, Charles Hamilton approached Emma in the parking lot. "Emma, I didn't expect to see you here. I wanted to understand who still considered Patricia important enough to attend her funeral." Charles looked older and more fragile than I remembered from the trial years earlier. Prison had broken something fundamental in his bearing. "Emma, I owe you an apology for my role in what happened to you." "Mr. Hamilton, I don't need your apology. I need you to understand that what you and Patricia did affected multiple women across many years." "I do understand that now. I've been working with a therapist to comprehend how I rationalized participating in Patricia's exploitation of you and the others." "What have you learned?" "That I convinced myself the financial benefits were secondary to the structure we were providing. That I chose to believe we were helping, rather than acknowledge we were exploiting." Emma studied Charles's face, looking for signs of authentic understanding, versus strategic positioning. Mr. Hamilton, what do you plan to do with that understanding? I've been volunteering with organizations that help trafficking survivors, not for court requirements or public relations, but because I need to contribute something positive to balance what I took from so many women. Do you think that balance is achievable? Charles was quiet for a long moment. No, I don't think I can balance 10 years of exploitation with any amount of subsequent good work. But I think I owe it to the women I hurt to try. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah Chen and Maria Santos, who'd also attended the funeral for similar reasons. Emma, Maria said, seeing all of us together like this, I keep thinking about how different our lives would have been if Patricia had never existed. Different how? Maybe I would have gone to college at 18 instead of 25. Maybe Sarah would have studied psychology earlier instead of after recovering from trauma. Maybe you would have become a teacher or a doctor instead of focusing on trafficking prevention. Emma considered Maria's speculation. Maybe. But would those alternative lives have been more meaningful than what we've actually accomplished? What do you mean? I've helped identify and prosecute 47 trafficking networks. Sarah's research has improved trauma therapy techniques for exploitation survivors. Maria's legal work has strengthened protective legislation in 3 states. Would we have had the same impact on preventing suffering if we'd had normal, non-traumatic lives? It was a profound question about whether meaning could emerge from tragedy, whether survival could create purpose that might not have existed otherwise. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Emma's right. I became passionate about trauma psychology because I understood it from the inside. That personal knowledge has made me more effective at helping other survivors. So you're saying Patricia's exploitation accidentally created 3 people who've prevented similar exploitation of dozens of other women? I'm saying we transformed what she did to us into protection for people she never even knew existed. As the 3 women talked, I realized I was witnessing something remarkable. Survivors who'd moved beyond recovery into active prevention, trauma that had been converted into protection for others. 6 months later, Emma was offered the position of director of the National Center for Human Trafficking Prevention, the most prestigious appointment in her field. The night before she accepted the appointment, we sat on the porch of my house in Princeton, discussing how much her life had changed since I'd found her scrubbing floors in a maid uniform. Dad, do you think Mom would have been proud of who I became? Emma, your mother would have been amazed by your strength and inspired by your compassion. Do you think she would have understood why I chose to build my career around the worst thing that ever happened to me? I think she would have recognized that you inherited her instinct to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Emma was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. I've been thinking about Patricia's death and what it means for my motivation going forward. Have you reached any conclusions? I think Patricia Hamilton was the catalyst for discovering my life's purpose, but she wasn't the source of it. I would have cared about injustice and exploitation regardless of my personal experience with it. How do you know that? Because my passion for this work has grown stronger, not weaker, as I've healed from the trauma. If I was only motivated by personal injury, I would have lost interest as I recovered. Instead, I've become more committed to prevention, as I've understood the scope of the problem. Emma was right. Her motivation had evolved from personal recovery to professional mission, from healing her own trauma to preventing others' trauma. Dad, I want to tell you something I've never said directly. What's that? Thank you for coming back for me. Not just physically returning from overseas, but refusing to give up when the situation became complicated. Emma, you're my daughter. Of course I came back for you, but you could have accepted the Hamiltons' explanations and convinced yourself I was fine. You could have avoided the legal complications and emotional difficulty of forcing me to confront my situation. Why would I have done that? Because it would have been easier for you. Fighting for me required you to admit that leaving me with the Hamiltons had been a mistake, that your 10-year absence had consequences, that recovery would be difficult and uncertain. She was right. Accepting the Hamiltons' version of events would have been much simpler than acknowledging my role in creating the circumstances that enabled Emma's exploitation. Emma, facing the truth about what happened to you was painful, but ignoring it would have been impossible once I understood the situation. That's what I mean. You chose truth over comfort, action over avoidance. That taught me more about courage than any therapy or education I received afterward. Emma had transformed 10 years of exploitation into a career protecting other vulnerable women. But she'd also learned something equally valuable about the importance of people who refuse to look away from difficult truths. Dad, I need you to know that my life now, my work, my relationships, my sense of purpose, all of it is built on the foundation of someone caring enough to come back for me. And I need you to know that watching you transform survival into service has been the most inspiring experience of my life. Emma accepted the appointment as director of the National Center for Human Trafficking Prevention. Under her leadership, the center would go on to identify and dismantle over 300 exploitation networks, rescue more than 800 victims, and train law enforcement agencies across 47 states. But that night on the porch, she was simply my daughter. Someone who'd survived the worst thing imaginable and chosen to use that survival to protect other people from similar harm. Patricia Hamilton had spent 10 years trying to convince Emma she was worthless. Instead, Emma had become proof that sometimes the most valuable people are those who understand suffering deeply enough to dedicate their lives to preventing it. 10 years after Patricia Hamilton's death, I sat in the audience of the Kennedy Center watching my daughter receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for her work in combating human trafficking. At 36, Emma had become the most recognized anti-trafficking advocate in the country, responsible for legislation that had fundamentally changed how law enforcement identifies and responds to modern slavery. President Martinez stood at the podium, reading Emma's citation to a packed auditorium that included trafficking survivors, law enforcement officials, and social justice advocates from around the world. Emma Patterson has dedicated her life to ensuring that exploitation, like what she experienced, will become increasingly difficult for perpetrators and easier for victims to escape. Her work has directly resulted in the rescue of over 2,000 trafficking victims and the prosecution of more than 400 criminal networks. The audience rose in sustained applause as Emma walked to the podium to accept the medal. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd learned to transform personal pain into public purpose. "Thank you, Mr. President," Emma said when the applause quieted. "I accept this honor not as recognition of my individual achievements, but as acknowledgement of what becomes possible when survivors are given the resources and support to turn their experiences into protection." Stopping briefly on the section where I looked out at the Jim Morrison, Detective Brennan, and Sarah Chen and Maria Santos, the other survivors who'd become advocates. 20 years ago, I was a young woman trapped in a situation I couldn't escape, convinced that I deserved nothing better than exploitation. I'm standing here today because one person, my father, refused to accept that narrative and fought to give me choices I didn't know existed. Emma's voice strengthened as she continued. "But I'm also here because of the 2 women who testified beside me in federal court, because of the law enforcement officers who took our stories seriously, because of the prosecutors who recognized that domestic trafficking is real and prosecutable, and because of the therapists who helped me understand that survival could become service." She paused, looking directly at me. "Most importantly, I'm here because I learned that the worst things that happen to us don't have to define our limitations. They can reveal our capabilities. Every trafficking network we've dismantled, every victim we've helped escape, every perpetrator we've prosecuted represents a choice to use power differently than the people who once controlled my life." The speech continued for 15 minutes, outlining Emma's vision for a comprehensive national strategy against human trafficking that would address both prevention and victim recovery. But what moved me most was watching her command that audience with authority that came from experience, knowledge earned through survival, and moral clarity forged in circumstances that would have broken many people. After the ceremony, Emma and I attended the reception at the White House. She moved easily through conversations with senators, Supreme Court justices, and international human rights advocates, discussing policy details and strategic priorities with expertise that had been built on the foundation of her own exploitation and recovery. "Dad," she said during a quiet moment between official conversations, "I've been thinking about something I want to share with you." "What's that?" "I realize now that Patricia Hamilton gave me an unexpected gift." I was startled by the statement. "What kind of gift?" "She showed me exactly what I don't want to become. Someone who uses power to control and exploit vulnerable people. Every decision I make professionally is informed by remembering what it felt like to be powerless." "So your experience with her serves as a moral compass?" "More than that, it serves as a source of empathy that I couldn't have developed any other way. When I interview trafficking survivors, I understand their shame, their fear of not being believed, their difficulty trusting people who offer help." Emma was describing how trauma had become a form of qualification for the work she'd chosen, painful experience that enabled her to connect with victims in ways that traditional social workers might not be able to achieve. "Emma, do you ever wonder what kind of person you would have been if none of that had happened to you?" "Sometimes, but I think I'm more useful to the world as someone who understands exploitation from the inside than I would have been as someone who only understood it theoretically." "Do you have any regrets about the path your life has taken?" Emma considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain that other people experienced because of what happened to me, your guilt about leaving me, the trauma that Sarah and Maria endured, the years of recovery we all needed. What about your own pain?" "Patricia Hamilton tried to break me. I don't regret my own pain but she anymore. Accidentally gave me taught me things for helping about other resilience rebuild and moral courage that I use every day in my work." Later that evening, Emma and I walked through downtown Washington, past the monuments and government buildings where she now worked regularly, advocating for stronger anti-trafficking legislation. "Dad, I want to tell you something I've never said directly." "What's that?" "Finding me scrubbing floors in that maid uniform was the best thing that ever happened to both of us." "How can you say that?" "Because it forced you to confront the consequences of decisions you'd been avoiding, and it forced me to discover strength I didn't know I possessed." Neither of us became who we were supposed to become until that moment. She was right, I realized. My return from overseas had forced me to face my failures as a father and fight for my daughter in ways I'd never had to fight before. Emma's exploitation had revealed capabilities and resilience that might never have been tested under normal circumstances. "Emma, are you saying that trauma can be transformative in positive ways?" "I'm saying that how we respond to trauma determines whether it becomes a limitation or a source of strength. Patricia Hamilton intended to limit me, but I chose to use what she did as the foundation for protecting other people." We stopped in front of the Lincoln Memorial, looking up at the statue of a president who'd guided the country through its own traumatic transformation. "Dad, do you think Lincoln would have been the same leader if he hadn't experienced the Civil War?" "Probably not. Crisis often reveals capabilities that peaceful circumstances never demand." "That's what I mean. My crisis with the Hamiltons revealed capabilities I never would have developed otherwise. The question isn't whether trauma is good or bad. It's whether we use traumatic experiences to become more compassionate or more bitter." Emma had developed a philosophy that transformed victimization into empowerment, survival into service, personal pain into protection for others. 6 months later, I attended the graduation ceremony where Emma received her doctorate in social work from Columbia University. Her dissertation had become the definitive academic analysis of domestic trafficking networks and victim recovery strategies. "Dad," she said after the ceremony, "I have something to tell you about my future plans." You're not leaving the trafficking center, are you? No, but I'm expanding my work. I've been offered a position developing international protocols for identifying and prosecuting trafficking networks. That sounds like important work. It is, but it would require extensive travel and collaboration with law enforcement agencies around the world. I realized what she was telling me. Emma, you're going to be doing internationally what I did when you were young. Traveling constantly, working in challenging environments, managing complex projects in difficult locations. The difference is that I'm doing it by choice, for a purpose I'm passionate about, and without abandoning anyone who depends on me. Emma was right. She'd chosen to use her capabilities in service of preventing the kind of suffering she'd experienced, while I'd used mine to avoid confronting my responsibilities as a father. Are you worried about the parallel? No. I understand now that leaving isn't abandoning if you're leaving to accomplish something meaningful, and if you maintain connections with the people you love. What do you mean? You left me with the Hamiltons because you were overwhelmed by grief and unprepared for single parenthood. You made the best decision you could with the information you had, even though it turned out badly. Emma, I abandoned you to people who exploited you for 10 years. Dad, you made a mistake. But you came back and fought for me when you understood what was happening. That's not abandonment. That's imperfect parenting followed by courageous recovery. Emma had developed the ability to see past my failures to my intentions, past her suffering to the strength it had created, past the Hamiltons' exploitation to the purpose it had revealed. Dad, I need you to understand something. The 20 years since you found me in that maid uniform have been the most meaningful years of my life, not despite what happened to me, but because of how I chose to respond to what happened to me. And I need you to understand that watching you transform your survival into service for others has been the most inspiring experience of my life. That night, I called Jim Morrison to share the news about Emma's international appointment. Richard, he said, when we first met about Emma's situation, did you imagine her recovery would lead to this kind of career? I hoped she'd be able to live independently and rebuild her life. I never imagined Recovery she'd become means someone returning who to prevents normal other people functioning. from experiencing what she Transformation experienced. means using traumatic That's the experiences difference between recovery as the foundation and for transformation. Extraordinary purpose. Emma had achieved transformation rather than just recovery, turning her worst experience into her life's mission. 5 years later, I attended the United Nations ceremony where Emma was appointed Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, the highest international position in anti-trafficking advocacy. In her acceptance speech, she said something that summarized everything she'd learned about survival, recovery, and purpose. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today not as someone who was once exploited, but as someone who chose to use that exploitation as training for protecting other people. The individuals who tried to convince me I was worthless accidentally taught me that my worth could be measured by my commitment to ensuring that what happened to me happens to as few people as possible. Emma had spent 25 years proving that Patricia Hamilton had been wrong about everything. Wrong about Emma's capabilities, wrong about her worth, wrong about her potential for contribution to society. But more than that, Emma had proved that sometimes the most valuable people are those who understand suffering well enough to dedicate their lives to preventing it. Standing in that UN Assembly Hall, watching my daughter address representatives from 193 countries about the global fight against human trafficking, I realized that finding Emma scrubbing floors in a maid uniform had been the beginning of something much larger than personal recovery. It had been the beginning of a life dedicated to ensuring that other daughters would never have to experience what mine had experienced, and that seemed like the most complete victory possible over people who'd tried to convince her she was powerless. Emma Patterson had become proof that sometimes breaking someone just teaches them they're strong enough to put themselves back together, and wise enough to help other people do the same.